Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm going to teach you something about the ancient meanings of the 12 houses. Here's the basic reason why I'm passionate about the ancient meanings of the houses. I'm passionate about them because, like a lot of things in ancient astrology, I feel that the original topics associated with the 12 houses are somewhat misunderstood. I believe that there are some really deep, mystical, and amazing reasons why the topics of the houses were originally assigned in the way that they were. Sometimes in modern astrology, for example, you'll hear the topics of the eighth house, like fear, anguish, worry, penalties, debt, poverty, really hard stuff, right? You'll hear some of those topics sort of whitewashed with themes like transformation or rebirth or something like that, which isn't altogether inaccurate. But we have to ask ourselves, why are we changing the topics of the houses 2,500 years later? Is it really necessary to change them? Have we properly understood the way that ancient astrologers were really thinking about the houses in the first place? Now, similarly with the sixth house, sometimes people will say, oh, the sixth house, it's a house of service, it's a house of health. Well, traditionally, it was actually a house of servitude or slavery and a house of disease, right? So a little bit different. But why have we changed the meaning today? Should we have changed the meaning? What were ancient astrologers really getting at when they were talking about the sixth house in such difficult language or such difficult terms? So I'm a classical or traditional astrologer, but I like to consider myself a pretty modern astrologer too. I like a wide range of different kinds of astrology. And I teach a course called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times, or sometimes I call it Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. And so I'm really passionate about trying to build bridges between ancient astrological theory and techniques and philosophy and methodology and modern theory and techniques. Because I believe that many people look at different elements of ancient astrology and they just go, oh, that seems really heavy or kind of dark, or there's certain elements that seem really technical and sort of clunky. And a lot of the times, I believe that this actually results from just an improper understanding or a sort of uninspired way of learning or teaching about really old astrological material. So, the purpose of this talk is to help you understand how the original meanings of the houses were arrived at by ancient astrologers, what some of those meanings are, and some of the brilliant and very esoteric, sort of secretive ways in which ancient seers and mystics were ever arriving at the topics of the houses in the first place. For example, why is the third house associated with siblings? Or why is the ninth house associated with religious life? Why is the fourth house connected to property or home? Things like this. So that's what we're going to take a look at today in this presentation. And hopefully going away from this, you'll have a deeper appreciation for the history of the houses within our tradition. And you'll also have a deeper appreciation for some of the more controversial topics that are sometimes related to the 12 houses. You'll know where they come from. And really, when you know where and how, where you understand the rationale behind why certain kinds of astrological symbols work in the way that they do, whether you're talking about planets or signs or houses or aspects, then you're equipped to be more artful in the way that you apply those symbols. It's kind of like if you understand the reasoning behind the rule, then you understand the application of the rule in a much more intuitive manner than you would if you just knew the rule. So similarly with the house topics, if you just know a bunch of topics associated with the houses and you've memorized them, but you don't understand how or why each section of the sky was originally related to those topics, then in a sense you're playing with, you're missing some cards in the deck. You're not playing with the astrological interpretation game with the same kind of artfulness that you will once you understand a little bit more about the reasoning behind these things. So, okay, that's my little spiel to begin with. Now, what I'm going to do is share a presentation that we're going to be going through together. this presentation is a kind of abbreviated version of a lot of time and depth that is covered in a course that I teach, where we spend a year together studying ancient astrology, but doing it in a way that's kind of conducive to the modern times that we're living in. And so this is sort of an excerpt from a 3-part lecture series that I do in my 1-year class. What to speak of maybe 15 to 18 more hours worth of audio recordings that I've made for students on each of the 12 houses, and trying to understand how and why ancient astrologers were using them in the way that they were. So, all right. Here's what we're going to do. I think it's always important to say what we're going to do and then do it. And I have to tell you, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to be sipping my tea while we go. All right, so in this talk, we're going to very briefly explore a hypothesis regarding the original rationale behind the assignment of house topics in natal astrology. The end goal is to give you some sense of the deeper reasoning behind why things like siblings belong to the 3rd house or money to the 2nd, health to the 1st, etc. First, we're going to, so that's the overall goal. That's the first thing that we're going to, that's our first agenda for the day. And then breaking it down, we're going to talk first about the concept of an astrological house. What is a house? Exactly where does this come from historically, this idea of houses? And then we're going to talk about why it's important to understand this rationale behind house topic assignment. And then we're going to talk about some common misunderstandings about the houses. Then we're going to introduce the concepts of what are called primary and secondary motion. These are very important concepts that we're going to be using to build like the scaffolding. We're going to be building upward upon these foundational concepts, which are both astronomical and philosophical. So we'll talk about primary and secondary motions of the sky. Then we're going to discuss the importance of angular houses and also the formation of what are called angular triads. These are groupings of houses and how they form the basis, along with the primary and secondary motions of the sky, of house topics. Then we're going to talk about how angular house topics, like the 10th house in career, or the 7th house in marriage, or the 4th house in family, or the 1st house in health or personality. We're going to talk about how those angular house topics are derived from the arrival of planets into certain places in the sky by means of the primary motion. So we're sort of building our way upward, and you'll see what primary motion is, and you'll sort of understand all of the pieces will be put in place at that point. Then finally, we'll discuss how the other houses in these angular triads are in turn formed according to the relation of a planet's secondary motions. This is another kind of motion we're going to be discussing, with the primary motion relative to the angular house and its topics. Does that sound confusing? It should, because this is an elaborate and very subtle and eloquent reasoning that's at work behind the topics of the houses, which frankly most people do not know, and it takes a little bit of explaining, but that's our ambitious project for the day. So all of this is going to lead us to an incredible series of insights about how and why we ever had the topics that we did assigned to the houses in the way that we do. So I should say in the beginning that much of this work, the groundwork for this presentation, was laid by an astrologer named Robert Schmidt. Robert Schmidt was the one of a group of people who was responsible during the late 80s, early 90s. There was increasing interest in classical forms of astrology. And there was a discovery made by a group of modern astrologers that there was in existence a large catalog of ancient Greek astrological source texts that had not been interpreted in English or were not available in English for a very, very long time, hundreds of years. And so Project Hindsight was formed in order to interpret / translate the early Greek source texts of ancient astrology. The result is that in the past 20 to 30 years, we have thus had a kind of renaissance or rebirth of ancient mystical forms of astrology. And one of the things that it's doing quickly for us is helping us recapture some of the original rationale behind why we ever came to do the things that we do as astrologers. Modern astrology in some ways has been bereft of some of its original founding classical information or knowledge. And so some of the ways that astrology has been passed down over the years into the modern era have been accurate and in keeping with the tradition, but in some ways the tradition has gone astray or been diluted somewhat from what it was. Now, this is all a part of how any field of art or history or any academic subject will evolve over time, and it's natural. But there's another sense in which there are some ways that we have drifted from our tradition. And so I'm very passionate about just trying to educate people about the differences and bring back some of what's good about our roots that we've lost. So at any rate, this is our outline. This is the path that we're going to take. So let's dive in. So the houses were originally called topoi by the Greek Hellenistic astrologers. Now, this was astrology that existed in the last 500 years BCE, all the way up till the decline of the Roman Empire in roughly the mid-6th century CE, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I think that was roughly the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. But they were, it was, the Hellenistic world was sort of Greek-speaking world into the Roman Empire. It does not mean it was exclusively Greek people who were doing astrology, not necessarily ethnically Greek as much as sort of regional Greek language and the Hellenistic culture. If you've ever studied history, you may know what sort of Hellenistic culture involves. And of course, the Roman Empire. And this kind of astrology really had its heyday in the Roman Empire period. That's when it was very popular. One of the most integral concepts to early horoscopic astrology is the concept of a house. That's what we call it today. But in fact, long ago, it was called a place, or topoi in Greek. A place is something more like a position. The best way of understanding it is like this. Let's say that you were to do a tarot reading. Most people know something about tarot, and so this shouldn't be too hard to understand. Let's say that you were going to do a 12-card spread in a circle, and the 12-card spread was to be for the 12 months ahead. Every card in the spread would be put into a position or a place. You'd have a place for January, you'd have a place for February, a place for March, and so on like that around the wheel. Similarly, in many different kinds of tarot spreads, you may have a place, if you were doing a family constellation tarot spread, you might have a place where the card that's put into that place will represent mother. A card will be put into another place that represents father. So very similarly, the 12 places can be thought of as 12 positions. What do? They designate different topics in an astral form of divination. The astral form of divination, what are the cards that they hold? They hold the signs. So in ancient astrology, the 12 places coincided with, or were sort of tantamount to, the ordering of the 12 zodiac signs around the wheel. Each sign was given to one place, just like one card would be given to one position in a spread. So you'd have one card for mother, one card for father, or one card for January, one card for March. So in ancient astrology, you could think of it as there is some debate, but a large amount of evidence supports that the earliest form of house division ever used, like you have Placidus or Koch or Regiomontanus or all these different kinds of ways of divvying up the house boundary markers around a chart. But in ancient astrology, each place was given one sign. So whatever sign was rising when you were born would become the first whole sign house. Then the second zodiacal sign in order would become the next whole sign house. So for example, if you were born a Taurus rising, Taurus would be the entirety of your first house. And then Gemini, the next sign in zodiacal order, would be the second whole sign house. And then Cancer, the next sign in zodiacal order, would be the third whole sign house, which means that the signs were falling into the places or becoming one of the 12 places. In fact, the word house was not even originally used to refer to what we now think of as a house. Again, they were called places, and the word house was used to refer to a sign. The reason for this is that the houses were thought of as the houses of the planets. So, for example, Leo is the house of the sun. Cancer is the house of the moon. Virgo and Gemini are the houses of Mercury, and so on like this around the wheel. Every sign is thus the house or home of a planet. So the word house was originally more appropriately used to designate a sign, and the word place was used to designate the different positions that the signs could coincide with or become at the moment of any given casting of a birth chart. So that's sort of the logic that was used by ancient astrologers, called what we call it now as whole sign houses. But it wasn't even really a form of house division as we think of it now. At any rate, so a place was not only a place like you would think of as we use the analogy of a tarot spread that held a sign and that therefore held the planets and so forth, but it also created an elaborate web of topical designations or assignments. For example, if your first house is Taurus, and Venus is therefore the ruler of the first place. Well, the topics of the first place includes health. Well, let's say that Venus is in the 12th house. So the ruler of the first house in the 12th will therefore give you information by combining or commenting on the topics of health from within the context of the 12th house. For example, you may have trouble or difficulty with health if the ruler of your health house, the first house ruler, is in the 12th house. That's one of many different possibilities that's one of many different possible interpretations, I should say, that one could make, but that gives you an idea. So the house topics were also distributed around the wheel through the signs coinciding with the houses. Like Taurus is your first house, Gemini is your second house, Cancer is your third house. And those topics associated with those places, like health or money or siblings, house 1, 2, and 3, the rulers of those houses, the planetary rulers, put into some other location around the wheel would give you an understanding of how to combine and interpret the topics. So that has been used as one of the primary ways of doing astrological interpretation for a very long time. So the significance of all of this for us is just for very basically to understand that the original concept of houses were actually places, and that the signs coincided with the places in a whole sign house kind of manner. Now, today, there's lots of different kinds of house systems that divvy up the houses in different ways, and that's fine. We're not here to have a debate about it or anything like that. But it's important that you understand that, because the rationale of how the different topics of the houses are arrived at has to do with the changes of one sign and one planet from one position or place to another. So that's going to become an important part of how we end up saying how we end up explaining the topics of the houses and how they came about. Okay. So here are two quotes to give you a little background on the whole sign house issue. In his book, A History of Horoscopic Astrology by James Holden, he writes, "To these elements, the inventors added the fundamental horoscopic concept of the celestial houses, originally conceived as a simple sequence of signs beginning with the rising sign." Excuse me. So the original ordering of the 12 signs around the zodiac is tantamount to the first house system. So each sign gets one place, and it's either the first sign that's rising, or the next sign in zodiacal order, the second place, or what we now call house, the third sign that's going to rise, or the third place or house, like that around the wheel, 1 through 12. Robert Hand, another historian and scholar of ancient astrology, says, after several years of research into the oldest texts of our astrological tradition, we now know what the earliest house system was. And in a way, it was not a house system at all as we understand house systems. Rather, it was the signs of the zodiac themselves used as a house system. In this system, the rising degree of the zodiac marks the sign it is located in as the first house. The rising sign itself thus becomes the first house, and we would refer to it from its very beginning to its end, regardless of where in the sign the rising degree may fall. The next sign to rise after the rising sign becomes the second house, the next sign the third house, and so forth. Actually, to understand this properly, one has to know that it is not that the signs were used as houses so much as there were no houses at all, merely the signs of the zodiac used as we would use houses, with no second separate 12-fold division of the chart at all. Whole sign houses describes this oldest way of dealing with houses and shows how effective it can be in modern astrology. So effective, in fact, that the author, as well as many other students of traditional astrology, has completely given up on modern house systems, not just for historical reasons, but even more importantly, because whole sign houses simply work better. Now, that's something to be tested on your own, perhaps, but just so you have some background about how houses were actually conceptualized and how they were used. It was a whole sign house system. Now, the topics of the houses were not originally configured in any kind of one-to-one correlation with signs or planets in the way that we think of them now. So in modern astrology, there's a kind of misconception that the meanings or topics of the houses have to do with the signs and planets related to them. So this is what is, sometimes we refer to this as the 12-letter alphabet theory. And in this system, there is no consistent astronomical or philosophical explanation for how we arrive at any of the topics of the houses, other than a kind of one-to-one correspondence between the first sign and first house, the second sign and second house, and so on like that. For example, we will say that Aries equals Mars equals the first house, Taurus equals Venus equals the second house, and Gemini equals Mercury equals the third house, like this. And in that way, we try to illustrate how the topics of the houses are arrived at. So for example, if you're talking about money in the second house, you say, well, why is money associated with the second house? And they say, well, Taurus or Venus. What I'm here to sort of teach everybody today is that this is not accurate. This system is outside of the tradition in the sense that this is not the original rationale that was used to arrive at the topics of the houses. The first house has nothing to do with Aries, in other words, or Mars. The second house has nothing to do with Taurus or Venus. The topics of the houses are built upon an entirely different kind of rationale. The topics of the houses, like the 12 different positions in a tarot spread, are rooted in a very different kind of logic. So that's what we're here to work on today. But in order to appropriately understand the way in which these topics were originally assigned to the 12 houses, we have to understand two very basic astronomical and philosophical components of ancient astrology, which are sometimes referred to as primary and secondary motion. Primary and secondary motions of the sky are just about the most fundamental and basic concepts in ancient astrology that form the bedrock of every other element of astrological theory, from signs to houses to the meanings of planets in their antipathies, sympathies and antipathies with one another, to what is called essential dignity. Why does one planet rule one sign or is exalted in another, in detriment in another, to the concepts of malefic and benefic planets, to the concepts of the planetary joys. There's all different kinds of ancient classical concepts in astrology that all break down to a kind of they reverberate with the idea of primary and secondary motion and the philosophical premises of astrology that are derived from or associated with primary and secondary motion. So what is primary motion and what is secondary motion? And we're going to be building from here very elaborately back to the idea of the houses and their topics. So hang with this. And if you need to along the way, you can always pause, go back, re-listen, because it's a little bit more complicated theory that we're talking about. So what is primary motion? Primary motion is that which carries everything in the sky clockwise, from rising in the sky to culminating overhead to setting in the west to anti-culminating deep below the earth to rising again in our eastern sky. So we perceive the sky from wherever we're located in a fixed manner. There's my eastern horizon, there's my western horizon, there's my high noon, and a planet will rise in the east, culminate at the high point of the sky, set in the west, and then it will appear to go below the earth down into the metaphorical underworld and then eventually rise again. So that journey that all the planets and stars along the zodiac take every single day happens in 24 hours because of the rotation of the earth on its axis. Everything is carried uniformly round and round and round in the same fashion over and over again, day in and day out, and that is called the primary motion. On the other hand, there is something called secondary motion. Secondary motion refers to the individual planets and all of their motions which run against the grain of the primary motion. So the primary motion of the sky from east to overhead to west runs clockwise. Meanwhile, the individual motions of the planets out in space are moving through the chart or through the sky counterclockwise. All the planets have their own individual speeds. For example, the sun is faster than Saturn, but the moon is faster than the sun. Mercury is faster than Jupiter, but Jupiter is slower than Mars. So they all have their different speeds. They also all have different kinds of synodic cycles with the sun, where there'll be an evening star. Venus might be an evening star, or Mercury might be an evening star, or they might be morning stars. They may have greater or lesser latitude relative to the sun, which is the kind of center line that the ecliptic is defined by, and that's the zodiac. So they might be above the sun's line or below it. They have different latitudes, and they vary. They go up above, they go down below, like that. But all of them are moving counterclockwise against the grain of the primary motion. So let me show you now a picture of this so you can see what this actually looks like. Here's an astronomy program I like to use called Starry Night, and it illustrates it really well. Here's the primary motion of the sky. You can see it moving along, kind of doing its thing, and it's going this way. Everything rises over here, roughly in the east. Everything culminates roughly at the top of the sky. This line marker is the meridian, which is sometimes called the midheaven. This is roughly where the sun is at high noon when it intersects that mark. And planets go from rising to culminating and then to setting over here in the west. This is the primary motion of the sky. Everything adheres to this motion, round and round and round and round, day in and day out. And that again is caused by the rotation of the earth on its axis. So let's stop this motion now and give you a sense of the secondary motion of the sky. What I want you to notice is that here the sun is what appears to be basically the beginning of the constellation of Virgo, right? You can kind of see that. Now, the constellations are no longer perfectly sort of aligned with the mathematical portions of the zodiac that they once were, which creates a bit of a problem. You have a tropical zodiac and a sidereal zodiac, and there's some good debates that can be had about that. So when I say that the sun is at the beginning of Virgo here, I don't mean that literally, but just for the sake of, in our tropical system, the sun is actually right now on September 18th closer to the entrance of Libra, and that has to do with the fact that the stars and constellations have drifted over time, and we continue to use a mathematical zodiac that's based on the unmoving points of the equinoxes and solstices, whereas a sidereal zodiac might take into account the drifting of the stars over time relative to the equinoxes. Again, not the point of our talk today. But for the sake of this, what I want you to notice is what happens to the sun when I start moving it day at a time. You're going to see it moving like that. Here, let me actually back this up just a little bit. Okay, this will be easier to see. All right, now, if I go day after day after day, watch the direction that the sun is moving in. See how it's moving through the constellation of Virgo, right? Now it's moving through the constellation of Libra. Now it's moving through the constellation of Scorpio, right? All of the planets are actually going in the same direction through the zodiac, which is this way. This is their secondary motion. What I want you to notice is, remember when I said that they have differing latitudes? See, this green line is the ecliptic, which is the line defined by the sun. But Venus could be up above, northern, like a latitude above the ecliptic, or it could be down below, somewhere down here. So the moon every month will actually snake like this around the ecliptic, and planets could be, relatively above the sun or below it somewhere. So their latitudes change, and their visibility changes if they're an evening star or a morning star, depending on how close or far away from the sun they are, when they'll be visible. And they're all moving through the zodiac out in space, which is basically means that they're moving around the sun out in space. They are moving counterclockwise against the grain of the primary motion. Okay, so these two motions, the primary and secondary motion, are also related to two philosophical kinds of categories. The primary motion of the sky, that which brings all of the planets through the sky, is the fastest motion. Nothing can overtake it. It's the sort of greatest motion in the sky. And everything participates in that motion along the zodiac. All the constellations, all the stars, as you saw in the demo that I did, they were all just moving uniformly in a circle, a great circle. Well, in a famous treatise called Timaeus by Plato, Plato refers to the primary motion of the sky in relation to the idea of eternity. So the reason for that is that there is this sense of everything moving in the same ideal, circular, repeating motion, unified by the same time factor, all caught up in the same grand circle. And that motion, Plato related to the idea of that which is eternal, unchanging, divine, perfect, ideal, what have you. On the other hand, Plato related the secondary motion of the planets, all of their different idiosyncratic cycles and speeds, and the fact that they're moving against the grain of the primary motion, he related that to the realm of materiality. So what is the difference between the two? Well, the realm of materiality is a realm where things come to be and pass away, whereas the eternal realm is a realm in which things exist, in a sense, in a more unchanging and permanent or perfect sense for Plato. So a simple example that you might hear in a philosophy sort of 101 class in college or maybe even high school or something like that regarding Plato's distinction between the ideal and the material would go like this. There's an idea of horse in your head, right? Like when I'm teaching my little daughter about horses, I teach her to identify a horse in like a little children's book. And so she says, horsey, horsey. And then when we're out in the world, every time that she sees a horse, she says horse, right? So in a sense, all horses are participating in an ideal image of horseness. But the individual forms in the material world will come and go. The black horse, the white horse, the brown horse, they will live and they will die, right? So in this material world, there is a reflection of something eternal, ideal, unchanging, perfect, perhaps a little bit more abstract and less concrete or material. But then there are also forms made of matter, and matter is always changing. It's always in flux. It's always impermanent, and it's always coming and going. So the secondary motion of the planets represents this material world and all of the changes and fluctuation and impermanence that exists here. So the two motions of the sky, the primary motion carrying everything round and round, and the secondary motion going against the grain of that, form the philosophical backdrop of astrology. You might be saying, wait, I don't get it. How does all of that come together? Okay, well, let's just give an example. Many different ancient mystical traditions believed in reincarnation of the soul. Essentially, they believed that the soul had come into the material realm due to a mistaken application of its free will, or due to some, for example, in Christianity, you have some original sin that was committed, or you have a kind of forgetting or a sleepness that is taking place in God. But there's different explanations. But the idea is that in this material world, we tend to get caught up in looking for happiness, for truth, for beauty, for love, for anything that is lasting and gives us a sense of peace, and that gives us a sense of happiness or knowledge. And we look for that among things that are changing. So, for example, I think to myself, gosh, eating an entire pizza to myself right now sounds really great. I bet you that's going to make me really happy. And it tastes good very temporarily, but then the pleasure goes away very quickly and we're left with stomachache, right? Or similarly, we fall in love instantly and we think it's going to last forever. And then we get used to the person and then we want someone different. Or I won't go on. You get the point. There are so many examples of this, and most spiritual traditions on our planet are based on the idea that we are eternal souls, eternal beings that have been mistakenly identified with our material form and therefore get caught up in different kinds of desires in the material world that essentially will not bring us the lasting kind of bliss, happiness, or knowledge that we really crave. Now, this is exactly what the sky is presenting us with an image of by means of the primary and secondary motion. So the primary motion is giving us that picture of eternity, that this realm is a kind of reflection of eternity, that eternity is here in its midst, but is also separate, as though this realm is a kind of mirror image of a higher realm. And yet, because we get lost in the illusion of thinking that this is all that there is, we suffer. We suffer in endless cycles of longing and getting and losing and fearing and, like this, all round and round and round. And that is what is reflected by the secondary motion of the planets in contrast to the primary motion. So when we look at a birth chart, what are we looking at? Well, the planets were referred to as wanderers, but some of the Greek etymological associations with the word for planet also implied things like straying from a set course, or deviation from the path, or even false prophets or false teachers taking advantage of or exploiting aimless people. Similarly, in Indian astrology, the planets were called grahas. The word graha means grabber, and it has the connotation of being about the forces of karma or fortune, what was called fortune in the West in some ways. The forces of karma or fortune that pull us along rather unconsciously through loads of pizza and loads of all sorts of material pursuits that don't really bring us happiness. And in fact, can be quite destructive, and it can create a lot of entanglement and suffering. So the planets in a birth chart basically represent the material karma or circumstances of change and of coming to be and passing away, the different kinds of forms in the different areas of life that one is going to experience as a soul who has come into the material plane. That's what a birth chart is indicating. Why would astrologers have studied the planets at all? You know what I mean? Why do this at all? Well, the basic idea is that you see in people like Vettius Valens and Manilius and Ptolemy, in all different kinds of ancient astrological source texts, is the idea that this knowledge was given or received by seers, wise people from divinity as a way of bolstering ourselves with sort of premeditative knowledge of where the flow of time and karma is heading. How is the wheel of fortune turning? And when you're aware of that, when you know where it's going, then you have the ability to prepare yourself for the ups and downs of the material world. And you can live through them with tolerance, humility, simplicity, love, a sense of acceptance, and you can stay, in a sense, in your center. Whereas those people who don't have any knowledge about this material world tend to think it's all by chance, that it's a little bit more chaotic, that I'm totally free, I'm not bound by anything, I'm in charge of everything, and that that whatever happens to me or around me dictates my happiness. When actually, for ancient astrologers, the purpose of studying all of this was to deepen the realization that your happiness is not dependent upon external circumstances. So by studying the movements of the grahas, the grabbers, the forces of material nature, and all of their cyclings and the way that they tend to grab us, we can retain the remembrance of that primary eternal identity that we are also a part of, that is in us, that we are as spirit souls. So those are the ways in which the primary and secondary motions of the sky form the philosophical backdrop for astrology. Now, once you have that in mind, you can understand some of the classical, there's many classical allegories and scriptures and things like that kind of bolster this idea. So Plato's Academy was thought to have been, in the thinking of the Platonic Academy, was thought to have been instrumental in the foundation of horoscopic astrology. Similarly, you have Plato writing an allegory of the cave, which you may have read about before. In the allegory of the cave, there's basically a prisoner who's sitting there and he's looking at shadows dancing across a wall in a cave. And eventually he realizes, he's in chains, and he gets out, and then he makes his way back and finds that there's a fire that's illuminating and creating the shadows on the wall. So he realizes the shadows aren't real. They're just projections, in a sense, coming from something else. So that gives him knowledge. And then eventually he makes his way out of the cave altogether into the light of the real world and the real sun, and sees things as they really are. Well, this is an analogy, or a kind of an allegory, that's pointing us toward what it means to be a mystic or a philosopher, or to be on a spiritual path. The stuff of this world is a kind of shadowy reflection of something spiritual. And as long as we're thinking that this is all that there is, we're in chains. We're prisoners of this place. But as soon as we start inquiring, what's really real? Is this really real? Do all of these external circumstances of my body, of my mind, of the world around me determine or define who I am or my happiness? No, they don't. So when we discover that, we have also metaphorically gotten out of our chains, and we've discovered the source of the fire. But then eventually we keep going and we get out of the cave. Plato kind of jokingly says that It's really hard to convince other people to get out of the cave with you because they don't want to come. They don't want to be bothered. And they'll even might try to attack you or harm you if you try to disrupt their illusion. This is, again, a classic kind of spiritual allegory. You find then the idea that astrology is not so much to be studied in terms of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? But instead to see that insofar as you're in the material world, you're caught up in a cycling, a predictable cycling of time. And it's based on laws and the unfolding of cause and effect. Karma is referring to action and consequence. The Greek word for this was praxis. But it means that the material world is basically operating according to predictable rules and a kind of algebra. And in that sense, everything is always fluctuating, Plato also said, between the opposites. So the realm of secondary motion, the realm of coming to be and passing away, the planets representing the material world, it's also connected to this idea that planets are always going from one form of extreme to another. So, this is why we have a whole language of what are called essential dignities to help us understand what it means when Venus is in Mars's sign, or Mars is in Venus's sign, or when Mercury is in Jupiter's sign, or Jupiter is in Mercury's sign, or what it means that a planet is exalted at this sign in this time of year, and this other sign it's depressed or fallen. There's a whole intricate language related to trying to understand the fluctuating, cycling, predictable dualities of this world. Whereas in the spiritual world, it's basically thought that all of these dualities are reconciled. They're not tearing us apart endlessly like they are here. And one of the reasons they tear us apart endlessly here is because we take them literally, and we tend to pick extremes. We polarize ourselves between the opposites, and so they tear us apart, and we suffer them. Whereas when you study astrology and you learn this language, and it teaches you about your karma, about your material, the place in the river that you've entered, and the way in which the different kinds of, the way that the karmic clock is ticking in your life, and the different kinds of things that are going to come up at different times within this realm of duality. When you study that, you have the potential to be liberated from it in consciousness. Meaning you can rise above getting torn apart by all of these warring opposites and predictable cycles of the planets. They go from being grahas, grabbers, things that grab you and pull you along like a puppet on puppet strings. They become less about taking you off from a set course, and they become more of your instructors in life. You know where this is coming, you know where that is coming, you know where the river is heading. You can stay centered in yourself a little bit more. You may still fall off, you may still have pain, you may still live a very human life on all external accounts, but it's the quality of consciousness and how you're relating to those experiences that start helping you to make your way out of the chains and out into the real world where you can see things as they are. And that is not something that necessarily means that you renounce or think of the material world as evil either. Okay. Whew. Right? That was a lot. The Yoga Sutras, similarly, remember Indian astrology is also the other major form of horoscopic astrology on our planet. And the Yoga Sutras, second shloka of the Yoga Sutras similarly says, the second sutra says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation of the revolutions of the mind. This word vritti, which is translated here as revolutions, is actually related to, has similar etymological connections to the Greek language and its use of the word that vritti has is related to the word for the revolutions of the sky in Greek. That's what I'm trying to say. And so the in a sense, very literally, the goal of yoga, like the goal of Buddhism and so many other mystical practices, is to learn how to still the mind, to learn how to control the mind and the senses, so that despite the raging turnings and fluctuations of the material world, that you're not perturbed by them. In a sense, that is the practice of all different kinds of contemplative, prayerful, meditative traditions on our planet, is to gain more of that sense of centeredness or peace, which slowly grants us the ability to see something transcendental in the midst of all the warring opposites. Okay, so now you have an understanding of the basic astronomical motions and their philosophical counterparts that provide us with kind of the bedrock of our ancient astrological theory. Now we're going to return to houses. We had to do all of that to get to houses, I know. So now we're going to kind of switch topics, but trust me, this idea of primary and secondary motion will come back. The houses are arranged in what are called angular triads. Before I can explain an angular triad, I have to explain an angle. All of ancient astrology is like this, where there's like concepts that are like nesting dolls inside of one another, and it's all very holographic. The houses, the ancient houses, are organized in what are called angular triads, which means that they are organized in bunches of 3 around one of 4 angular houses. What is an angle? Why is it important? Well, angular houses, the 1st house, the 10th house, the 7th house, and the 4th house. Let me just illustrate this with you so you can see. So the 1st house, angular. The 10th house, angular. The 7th house, angular. The 4th house, angular. So these are the angular houses. These houses were originally called kentrons. They were given extreme significance, total importance. So what is a kentron? Why were these angular houses given such importance? Remember, this is in a whole sign house system. They're given such importance because they are places where as a planet arrives to these portions of the sky within the primary motion of a 24-hour day, they are taking very critical turning points within their journey. So let me just go back now and show you again what this looks like. So for example, the 1st house, a planet, this you see the degree of the ascendant, that's the degree of the eastern horizon. Planets in the 1st house are rising into the visible sky for the first time. So remember that primary motion of the sky, if we go back to it again and point it out, let's go back and show you this. The primary motion of the sky, if we just back this up, there it is, due east, you can see that this area of the ascendant, an angular house, whatever house is rising there, that becomes the 1st whole sign, or whatever sign is rising there becomes the 1st whole sign house. What's happening in that area of the sky? Planets are first appearing from below the horizon for the first time. So this marks a critical turning point with regard to the primary motion of the sky. And day by day, hour by hour, new things are always rising in this portion of the sky. And it'll either be more, it might be more easterly, like up here. It can go down to sort of more like the southeast down here, but they appear roughly in this area of the sky for the first time. Okay. So, going back to the chart, the 10th house, and that's why it's so pivotal, because it represents this unique moment in the day, right? Things are first appearing there. How about the 10th house? 10th house is called angular or pivotal, and it's very important because in this place, planets are reaching the high point of the sky. So let's go back to our astronomical diagram and see what that looks like. So basically, if you back this up by an hour, you'll notice now that the sun is basically at high noon. So this is sort of roughly the area of the 10th whole sign house, so the top of the sky. So when a planet reaches the high point, what happens next? Well, this is the high point, which represents culmination, which means it will then start to set next. When you get to the 7th house over here, the planet will set in the west. So that reaches another pivotal point. And then when the planet goes all the way under the Earth and reaches the sort of, when it's the sun, it would be the darkest point of night, it will reach the bottom of the chart. Whoops. And then from that point on, it's anti-culmination. It's reached the low point below the Earth, and it'll start to rise again. So the ending and the beginning point is house 4. The setting point is house 7. The high point is house 10, and the rising point is house 1. Well, let's go back and look at our chart and just make sure that that's extra clear. So the high point, house 10, the setting point, house 7, the anti-culminating point where a planet reaches the low point, but then will start to rise again, see, beginning and end, and then the rising place where it will appear again. Now, these places were called kentrons, and for the entire history of astrology, as long as astrologers have been doing astrology, angular houses are given primary importance. If you have planets in an angular house, they are incredibly strong, incredibly pronounced, and very important in your chart. Why? Well, again, as you can see, critical turning points within the 24-hour day, or the 24-hour motion of the primary motion that happens within 24 hours, are taking place. They were called kentrons, which means that they were, the word has a connotation of being like a goad. If you don't know what a goad is, it's like a spike, or like a spur that you would use to kick a horse to get it to go. Right? Not a nice thing to do, but if you were to goad something into action, you're like prodding it into action. When a planet reaches this critical turning point, it's as if it becomes energized. Just think about it kind of psychologically. When you see the moon rising in the east, right? It's like, oh, right? It has that feeling of like, well, ancient astrologers said that it had oracular significance. It speaks. But then as it rises into the sky, like, it's beautiful. But then, you know, oh, think about when it reaches the very top of the sky. It's like at the pinnacle of the sky. Again, oh, right? It has that powerful feeling to it, like it's been sort of punched into action. It's been energized. They were also, these angular places were also thought of as pivots or hinging places, where there was a kind of hinging or revolving or swiveling or turning, and therefore it was a critical turning point. Similarly, if you see a planet setting, like the sun setting, you're like, oh, like it has that significance to it. Now, we can't see planets below the Earth, but the sense of a planet being, you know, deep, deep below in the lowest place possible and then starting to rise or emerge again has very deep esoteric connotations when you think about it. So each of these places were centers of power, and the topics of these houses come from the kinds of astronomical things that are happening that I've in those places that I've just been describing. So now we're going to look at those very briefly. We're going to look at those, but one more thing. So that's how we're going to end up getting our house topics for 1, 10, 7, and 4. What are planets doing in those key locations of the sky at that moment, those moments when planets are being energized in that particular way, okay? But the next thing that you need to know is that houses were also arranged according to what are called angular triads. So now I'm just going to pull up the chart again and show you what an angular triad looks like. So here's what an angular triad looks like. Angular triads are formed with regard to houses that are on either side of an angular house. For example, house 12 and house 2 both flank house 1. Similarly, the angular house 10 is flanked by house 11 and house 9. House 7 is flanked by house 8 and house 6. And the angular 4th house is flanked by house 3 and house 5. This creates 4 different sets of houses called angular triads. How do we know that houses were arranged this way? Because the most basic names of the houses have to do with whether they are falling away from the angle or moving into the angle next. So let me show you what that looks like. Now, you're going to have to like hang with me for a second, but look at this chart. Let's say this was a birth chart. If we were to go 1 hour previously, let's say 2 hours previously, notice how the Libra moon now switches into the first house, and Libra is the first house. So if you were born at this time, Libra would be your first house. But if you're born 2 hours, an hour later, now Libra is the 12th house. So the 12th house has the connotation of having been in the seat of power and having just recently fallen out. See how that works? Having just been in the seat of power an hour ago, but just recently fell out. So every 12th house is always referred to as a declining place, in the same way that house 9 is thought of as a declining place. House 9, if this was your birth chart, it was house 9, but just recently, if you backed up an hour, it was house 10. So it was the angle, but it's declined or fallen out of the powerful position. See? Like that, an hour later, it's declined to become the 9th house. Similarly, house 6 is called a declining place. If you were born right here, you'd be like, well, Libra was the 7th house, but it's just fallen out of that position of power. Why? Back up the chart by an hour. Oh, there's the moon in Libra in the 7th. Go forward an hour, it's declined away from that angular position of power and become the 6th house. Similarly with house 3. House 3 is called a declining place because an hour ago, it was the 4th. Now it's become the 3rd. So houses 3, 12, 9, and 6, their most basic definition is that they are all called declining houses, which means they take their most basic and fundamental meaning or reference in relation to the angle that they were just in that they have fallen out of. Whereas all of the other houses are referred to as succedent houses. So for example, house 2. If you were born like this, you'd be like, oh, well, the moon is in the 2nd house. But what is the 2nd house? Why is it called succedent? Because it succeeds the angles. Sometimes it's called post-ascensional, which means it's ascending to the position of power after or post. So what happens an hour after this person is born? 2 hours, let's say. The moon in Libra moves into the 1st house. An hour before, it was in the 2nd. An hour later, it becomes the place of power. So it succeeds the throne, so to speak. It becomes powerful in time. Similarly, house 11, right here, succedent house. Why? Because where is it heading? It's heading toward the 10th. Watch what happens if I move this forward another hour. Well, it's going to move. Now it tricked me because the moon is moving signs. Back it up just a little bit. So let's go around again. Let's give it earlier, Libra, to make the point. Okay, so where is it heading in an hour? To the 10th. So here's Libra moon in the 11th. Where is it heading in an hour? It's going to become the powerful place of the 10th. It's the succedent house. How about the succedent 8th place? Well, the 8th place is going to become the 7th place of power next. Watch. Oh, there it is. Becomes the 7th house. Similarly, the 5th house. 5th house moon, where is it heading? It's going to become the 4th house next. So it becomes it next. So the succedent houses are named because those houses in time will become the angular house. So all of the houses are arranged in angular triads in the way that I've just explained. You have your angular house here, and then you have 2 houses on either side flanking it. Either one is going to become the position of power, or one is looking longingly at the place having just fallen out of the position of power. Succeeding the throne, having just fallen out of the throne. That's the basic idea behind how the houses are organized into 4 groups of what are called angular triads. Okay, You've got this. You see how important primary and secondary motion is already? You're getting a feel for it because primary motion is what's determining the ordering of the houses and eventually their topics. All right, so let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, first of all, how do we get to the meanings of the angular houses? Well, listen to what Manilius says, first of all, about how important the angular houses are. He says, "Come now, prepare an attentive mind for learning the cardinal points." Those are the angular houses. "For in all, they have positions in the firmament permanently fixed and receive in succession the speeding signs. One looks out from the rising of the heavens as they are born into the world and has the first view of earth from the level horizon." That's the ascending place of the first house. "The second faces it from the opposite edge of the sky, the point from which the starry sphere retires and hurtles headlong into Tartarus." That's the underworld. That's the seventh house. "A third marks the zenith of high heaven, where wearied Phoebus," that's the sun, "halts with panting steeds and rests the day and determines the midpoint of shadows." That's the 10th house. "The fourth occupies the nadir and has the glory of forming the foundation of the sphere." That's the 4th house. "In it, the stars complete their descent and commence their return." They start rising again. "And at equal distance, it beholds their risings and settings. These points are charged with exceptional powers, and the influence they exert on fate is the greatest known to our science, because the celestial circle is totally held in position by them as by eternal supports." "Did they not receive the circle sign after sign in succession, flying in its perpetual revolution, and clamp it with fetters at the two sides and highest and lowest extremities of its compass, heaven would fly apart and its fabric disintegrate and perish." So he's suggesting that the way in which heaven and earth are connected, the sky, the starry sky, and the earthly sphere, the terrestrial and celestial, are connected at these 4 clamping points as well. This is really esoteric, deep stuff, but it gives you a sense of just how important those cardinal places were, and the fact that it's the primary motion of the sky that's determining the associations of the topics, not the signs, not some association with Capricorn or Aries or Libra or Cancer or something like that. So let's look at the rationale and meanings of the 4 angular places very briefly. The ascendant is where planets first appear or rise. And it's conceptualized as the helm or steering wheel of the ship of life. It's the house that most personally refers to the life, health, vitality, soul, spirit, psychology, and body of the native. Every other house in the chart refers to something other than you: your money, your siblings, your spouse, da-da-da. The first house is you. Ancient astrology, it's much more personal than we think of it today. It's thought of as the foundation of the chart, and all other places derive their meaning in part from their relationship to this place. That's a separate topic we can't go into. The first place was associated with Mercury. It was the first house was called the joy of Mercury. That's also because Mercury is sitting on the horizon between the upper world and the lower world, and Mercury had the role of being the one who could navigate between the two. And there's more about that another time. Here's a quote from Manilius. It's on the screen. If I put some of these quotes up, not that I'm going to read through them, but so that you could go back and pause the recording and read through what Manilius says about them, which might be really interesting to you. But the first house is basically associated with the life of the native, because this is the place where stars and planets first appear. And so we anchor the entire birth chart at the moment that you first appear in the world. And so there's a correlation between you and your first appearance at birth, out from the womb in darkness of the womb from your mother, into the world, into the visible light of the world, just as planets are appearing from below the horizon in the womb of the earth, appearing into the visible world for the first time. So the correspondence between the birth or first appearance of you and the first appearance of stars is why we have such personal associations with the first house. Health, vitality, spirit, intelligence, personality, psychology. It's your spirit and soul. Your first house is you. Now, you also have to remember that ancient astrologers come from a divinatory tradition, which pays attention to signs, symbols, and omens in nature. and the appearance of a bird or the appearance of an image in a dream. Um, the time that something appears is thought of as the moment the moment of divination. So when something appears, that's the time at which you want to try and, jot down the time, look at the sky, and get some reflection of the meaning or significance of the appearance of the omen or sign. But all divination has to do with the importance of something interrupting the normal ebb and flow and appearing. You're walking in the woods and suddenly a snowy owl comes, lands on a branch in front of you. It's like, whoa, this just interrupted my life. But the appearance of that thing for the first time is the moment of oracular significance. It is interrupted and has a message. Similarly, in the ancient world, the appearance or arrival of a child was itself an omen. So in a sense, the first house as the appearance of the baby is symbolically suggesting that your physical form is a kind of omen to be read. The appearance of your physical form in this world is a kind of omen to be read. It is its own dream image to be interpreted. And that's why the first house is also correlated with you. So now, if we go forward to the 10th place, and I'll go back here just for a second so that if you'd like, you can pause and read this quote on the screen from Manilius, which gives you a little bit more. And I've already gone through the demo that I was going to do, showing you what the 10th house is and everything. So yeah, so you can pause and read this if you want. All right, so the 10th place. The 10th place, or the midheaven sometimes, reflect culminating points. The 10th place is where something is lifted up on high. It's at the peak of its journey, its culmination. Well, this place was called praxis by the Greeks, karma in the Indian tradition, and the word means action. Not just action, but the idea of action and consequences of action. This is the place that somehow defines public reputation, status in the world, fame and infamy, rulers, and the idea of occupation or career. Why? Because this is a place that's most visible. And so the actions you take in the world, outside of the private sphere and more in the public sphere, and the consequences that they have in the world that are visible for everyone to see, lifted up on high, and the ability to rise to a certain rank, or to feel that you have a calling or a special sense of destiny in the material world. All of those things are contained in some ways by the 10th house. It's not just career, in other words. It has more to do with the culmination, things that are lifted on high, things that are very visible, things that are very powerful, that lord over us. So it's related to authority. It's related in some sense to the civilization that we live in and our role within it, like that. Okay, so you can read what Manilius wrote here as well, but you can see how the topics, you can make an association with Capricorn, and that may be fair, but that's not originally how the topics of the 10th were being arrived at. It has more to do with the motions of the stars and planets and what they're doing when they reach this place in the sky. And you'll see how intricate and beautiful the logic of the other house topics is beyond the angles, because the angles are really the easy part. All right, so you can check out this quote if you want by pausing again. And here's another point. Now, Manilius has some very interesting and sort of atypical associations that he makes with the 10th house and Venus. Those are unique even for among ancient astrologers. So he's kind of on his own trip on that one. But it's very interesting association that he makes with Venus in the 10th house. Anyway, more on that a different time. So judgment, rulers, kings, authorities, career, fame, success, reputation, notoriety, infamy, calling, accomplishment, culmination, or rank. Those are things you can think about with the 10th. So hopefully that makes sense. Next is the 7th. The 7th is one of the most complicated. The 7th, or descending place, is the next pivotal or angular place that planets travel through in the 24-hour day, and it represents the place where planets set or disappear. And it was related to the end of troubles and strife. Why? Because a planet has traveled and sort of traveled all the way over the mountain of the sky. You know, it's climbed all the way up, it's come all the way down. So it's a finishing point. It was in some ways associated with resolution, justice, endings. It's related to death and the entrance into the underworld. It's related to also celebrations, banquets, marriages, worship of the gods, all different kinds of things that we essentially do when the day and the work of the day is done. So I always use this example. I say, you don't say, I'm going to a concert this morning. You say, I'm going to a concert tonight. You don't say, I'm going out for a glass of wine this morning, hopefully. You say, I'm going out to dinner with my friends this evening. Why? Because the work of the day is done. And during the evening, we connect to magic, to mystery, to the unknown, to a sense of surrendering ourselves or letting go. We worship, we praise, we sing, we go, in the old world, this would be a time for religious festivals or lighting candles and worshiping the gods, saying prayers. This is also a time of celebration. The party's here. The day is done, has that kind of a feeling. It's also a place where things come to endings naturally. And there is maybe a sense of justice in the seventh as well, a little bit like resolution or coming to resolution about things, the way that things resolve. So it's from those designations and the setting of a planet that we originally have association to marriage. But the topics of the seventh are actually much broader than just marriage or relationships. For example, you see people like Kurt Cobain, Marilyn Monroe, and many others with great seventh house planets, where they were worshipped or celebrated as gods, or they were people that helped us connect to something artistic or imaginative. Barack Obama had a seventh house sun. He was called a popular president. The place was also said to be strong in faith because it surrenders that which is given to it. Whatever comes into the seventh house sinks and disappears right away. There's something ephemeral and nocturnal and imaginative and dreamy about the seventh house. And we lose that a lot by just thinking of it as the place of relationships. It's a romantic house, possibly a sexual house, and it is related to marriage and anything that we can immerse ourselves into that's sort of greater. But it is a much more mysterious and mystical house than people generally realize. There are a lot of different topics that happen in the seventh house that have to do with popular appeal and the things we do to, again, connect to something bigger. So again, there's some quotes from Manilius you can look at. And then here's some other, you'll notice leisure, social events, banquets, death, worship of the gods, closing years, and end of life. There's a connection to social life in the seventh for sure. But it's, again, much broader than that. And eventually there's other topics that come into the tradition, like lawsuits and quarrels and things like that, and that having to do with the opposition to the ascendant. But that's a separate topic. Finally, the fourth place and the IC, the bottom of the chart, reflect anti-culminating points below the earth. And they were related to the foundations of all things because they're the foundation of the chart. But it was much more mystical again. The beginning and end of all things, rest, homeostasis, hidden riches, the underworld, buried treasures, family, ancestry, the land, effects that are less showy or public, but more substantively supportive, rooted and foundational, secrets, mysteries, the occult, the past, parents, the underworld, death and reincarnation, a lot of like deep esoteric things in the fourth house. So, it was more, also in the ancient tradition, it was more associated with one's father because it was thought of as the source from which one comes that's less substantive and less visible, which is the secret seed of the father, right? The seed of the father is not as apparent as the womb and body of the mother that carries the child. It's also the idea that they were a more paternal culture and thought of parentage in a more paternal way. And so the root of your ancestry comes from your father in that sense. But I think we can apply, and the mother was the 10th, different reasons, but we can apply the basic meaning of the fourth house and father and say parents in general, or parentage or ancestry. So fourth house, though, deep stuff in the fourth house. And this all has to do with planets coming down to that bottom of the chart. So again, Cancer, a nice association. The moon, a nice association, but not the original rationale. Now notice that there's a complementarity between first and seventh, 10th and fourth. The first and seventh, for example, the place where something's rising and appearing for the first time, the place where something's setting and disappearing, and they have totally different vibes. Sometimes in modern astrology, we say self and other, but other in the seventh is much broader in ancient astrology than just marriage or partnership, you could say. Similarly, the 10th and 4th, 10th very public, 4th very private, 10th very visible about notoriety, fame, visibility, 4th less showy, less public, but more substantively supportive, more about ancestry, land, parentage, home, property. There's a complementarity between the two, most visible, least visible for planets, rising, setting for planets. But that's the rationale, it has to do with the primary motion of the sky. Now, next, what we need to do is the most complicated part, and I'm just going to give you a preview because it's too complicated to break down for every house. In fact, I have like an 16, 18-hour series going through each of the houses explaining this philosophy. So it takes a long time to really get into it. But I'm just going to give you a preview of how the other house topics are formed using primary motion along with secondary motion. And this gets really interesting. All right. And in case you're interested, these are the different sources that I used for today's presentation. You can check out if you're interested in learning about any of them. I would, again, point you to the real inspiration for this being Robert Schmidt. Okay, so let me switch over to my chart again and just give you a little introduction. So the 8th house was associated with some pretty heavy topics long ago. For example, it was associated with fear, anguish, worry, the unknown, worry specifically about the future, and death. Why? Why was it such a morbid house? Well, because, let me back this up and take the moon into the 8th house so you can see it. I'm going to make my camera a little smaller. Now, when the moon is in the 8th house, where is it heading by secondary motion? By secondary motion, the moon is faced away from the 7th house, the angle that it's heading toward by primary motion, and it's moving, toward Scorpio in its secondary motion. So we use this sort of metaphorical, and we say that the planet is turned away from the angle. You understand, because if I'm walking down the street, and I'm the moon, I'm headed toward the 9th house. But what if I don't know it, but a tractor beam that's stronger and faster than me heading towards Scorpio is pulling me down into the 7th house? Get what I'm saying? This is where the 8th house topics come from. The planet in this house is being pulled against its will, which is represented by its secondary motion. It's by the unfolding of its own material course. Remember, the planets represent the secondary motion of the planets represent the material world, which is filled with desiring and forces that are moved along and being moved along by the will and choices and desires of all sorts of different sentient beings. So the material universe is unfolding like that, in a sense, according to a huge amalgam of different choices and willpowers that are being exercised. So the secondary motion of the planets through the zodiac refer to the planet's intentionality. The planet in Libra is intending away from the angle, but the primary motion is bringing it down. And so we have fear of the future, anxiety of the future, worry about the future, the unknown, and death, all kind of morbid topics. Why? Because the planet is moving away from the place where it will set and disappear into the underworld, but it is being dragged there, in a sense, against its own will, or it's being dragged there unconsciously, or that's the direction that it is being brought toward. But because it's intending in the opposite direction, it has a conflicted relationship with where it's being brought to. That's why the 8th house has to do with all of these heavier topics. It's also related to, like, the 8th house is a heavy relationship to trying to avoid things we don't want to have to deal with, avoidance of the deeper, darker stuff that we don't want to deal with. And sometimes we try to whitewash the topics of the eighth house in modern astrology, specifically because we're being so eighth housey. We're afraid of dealing with things that are inevitable or unknown. Similarly, the eighth house planet is trying to get away, in a sense, from an inevitability that it's heading toward. Okay, so that's where the eighth house topics come from. What about the sixth house topics? I'm just going to give you some very brief examples here. The sixth house topics are, in ancient astrology, were also very difficult. Slavery and disease. Sounds awful, right? But why? Well, in this case, look at what the planet is doing. The planet, again, by its secondary motion, now is heading toward or facing the angle. But will it get there? Will it get back into the position of power? No, it's fallen out of the position of power. Where is the primary motion bringing it? Down to Hades, down into the underworld. So this planet is, in a sense, longing, striving toward getting back to that place of the seventh house. What was the seventh house? Happily ever after house, right? That was the place where things resolve nicely, where things are balanced out, where there's connection to higher things, where there's, in a sense, banquets and feast and, a happy resolution. That's what the seventh house is all about, is resolution. What happens in the sixth? The planet is seeking or striving for that place of resolution, but it can't reach there because the primary motion is stronger and is bringing it down. That's why this house was associated with slavery, because there is a condition that persists, that's dogged, that you can't get out of, that's dragging you down. And that was thought of as conditions of hard labor, servitude, or slavery. How about disease, sickness, degenerative or chronic health problems? All similar. The planet is seeking resolution, aiming toward that place, but it can't get there. The primary motion is bringing it down. And so degenerative or deteriorating health conditions. Now, are there light topics associated with the sixth and the eighth? Of course. For example, facing the unknown may have something to do with encountering things that are subversive and being challenged to transform because we have to face subversive things, right? Or come to terms with things that we don't want to. And there can be sort of gold in the darkness of that. Similarly, the sixth house. A lot of the times we whitewash the sixth house and we say things like, well, the sixth house is all about service. And it really is a service-related house, and it's about health. Well, no, it's related to slavery and servitude, and no, it's related to disease and sickness. But it was also called the joy of Mars, and it has to do with fighting and hard or oppressive conditions. And many people are called to be of service because of those conditions. So people are called to be doctors, nurses, pro bono lawyers, social workers, saints, whatever, because suffering exists, because cruelty exists, because chronic health problems exist. You also see fighters in the sixth house, people who fight, battle, chronically work or labor, sometimes workaholics. For example, Muhammad Ali, sixth house sun. He was a literal fighter, a boxer. Sixth house joy of Mars was also the traditional place of military training. He was, however, an anti-war activist and a civil rights icon, and throughout his life fought both literally and sort of politically. And yet he also died of a degenerative disease and Parkinson's, right? So similarly, Bernie Sanders, moon, if we have his rectified chart right, moon Mars in Aries in the sixth house. He's a champion of the underdog. He's a fighter for the people and for civil liberties. This is moon Mars kind of sixth house, right? It's like that. But you also have people like Judy Garland or Whitney Houston, really complicated sixth houses where they were workaholics, addicts, etc. Prince's health house ruler was in the sixth house. He was a workaholic, died of drug, related overworking and drug related complications. You will see that both the sixth and the eighth have some redeeming qualities, but it's once you understand the substantive reasons why the astronomy of the sky generates the topics, you have a much broader way of working with the house topics. And I'm just scratching the surface here, so I'm just trying to give you a preview. I'll do a few more just to give you a hint of how this works. Let's say the third, a little bit more positive. The third house, the planet in the third, again, the moon, any planet in the third will be intending toward the fourth. It's looking at that angular fourth place, moving toward it. But the primary motion faster has brought it away from or out of the angle and is bringing it to rise. So what is the fourth house? Well, we said home, land, family, ancestry. Why is the third house the house of siblings? Because a planet in this house has been brought away from the home, the roots, or the family, and yet gazes back upon it. And so what are siblings? Siblings are people who all share a common root, who all look toward the same common root, but who have all come away from or apart from that common root. That's why the third house is also associated with neighbors. You share a similar home base or root, like the land or area that you live in, but you're all spread out differently within that land. So similarly, the archetype of messengers and writers and communicators and things like that, the fourth house has the connotation of being the original, the origin point. And so what is a messenger? The carrier of an original out into the world. You're keeping your sight on the original, but you're being carried outward from that place of origin. And that's the archetype of a messenger. There's so many more, but the simple point is that, again, it's by the combination of the planet's secondary motion. I'm looking in toward the roots there, but I'm being brought away from and sort of disseminating outward from those roots. This was considered a more positive or constructive house. 6 and 8 are a bit more difficult. So the astronomy here ends up in topics that are a little bit more sort of likable. Similarly, if you go to, I'll just do one more. If you go to the second house, in the second house, the planet is turned away from the first, heading toward Scorpio here, but it's being brought into the first house. So this has to do with things that in time will grow and move into the first house to benefit the native. So for example, why is money associated with the second house? Because it has to do with what you can earn. In time, what will grow and produce results for you. Why is it results for you? Because the planet in this house, in time, will come to your house. It'll be in your possession. So anything in this house means in time, it will come to you. So it was traditionally, therefore, related to, the process of things that grew. The second house was related to agriculture and fields and crops and gardens, things that grew in them, and things that could therefore supplement or support you, literally by eating food or things that you could sell or things that you could grow and sell or whatever. It was also called bios, which means substance. Anyway, there's a lot more to the second house, but that's a quick example. And the planet being turned away in this case is, in a sense, about things that are a little bit more unconscious in this sense. You're not as aware of where they're heading. And there was a connotation here in the second house of great materialism. So something that you are unconscious of that's sort of growing beneath the surface that in time will come to you for better or worse. So for example, if you have rampant material desires and you have like Mars in the second house, in time, money crisis could come to you because of overspending, because of too many desires. Similarly, if you have Venus in the second house, you could really like expensive things, and in time that could become a problem. So there's a sense of the planet being turned away from, but being brought toward the first house. That means we're not always exactly aware of what's growing there and of what will come of it to us in time. So you have to be very careful about all of the succedent houses, because in time they come to us and we have to deal with them in a much more intense way. But also you can think of the second house planets as representing things that we are intending or hoping for in the future, but we don't have a clear idea exactly of what will come. Again, the planet being turned away from the place that it's being brought to represents a kind of longing or hoping for something, but we don't know exactly how it will turn out. And that's common for house 2, 11, 8, and 5. They all have something like that in common. Whereas the 8th house rather than hoping or longing for something, not sure what's coming, tends to be more about fearing or being anxious of what's coming. So there's complementarity between the two. At any rate, this gives you a preview of how this works. And what I hope you've learned from this, first of all, the simple misconception that I'm hoping to sort of correct. I don't want to be on a high horse here, but I do think it's a misconception that the house topics have anything to do with the signs. The house topics of the first house don't have to do with Aries. They have to do with primary motion. The house topics of, the sixth or the eighth house, like we just explored, they don't have to do with Virgo or Scorpio. There's some nice associations being made there symbolically, but those houses have to do with the interaction of primary and secondary motion around the seventh house and its topics. Once you know this, I promise you that both philosophically, methodologically, and just practically speaking, you get into this kind of study more, you're going to know a lot more about astrology, and you're going to be a lot happier with your practice because you're going to feel like I'm really grounded. I really know the roots of where everything comes from, how things were used. And I think that gives us confidence as astrologers. To me, I would say it's also like a jazz musician. You know your scales, great, but if no one ever teaches you the kind of thinking or reasoning behind the scales, what chance do you stand, of really kind of improvising? Or if no one teaches you that improvising is possible, then how would you know how to do it? This kind of esoteric, secretive, hidden wisdom is the kind that once you spend the time getting to know it, you will have a key to using the houses in a much more diverse and intuitive manner than people who have just memorized lists of topics. So I hope that this was really interesting for everybody. I'd like to direct everybody to close here to just a few things online. First of all, if you want to follow me, I write daily horoscopes and pretty regular updates on my video blog as well on YouTube. You can find me at Facebook, so I'll show you that really quick. So there's the Facebook page. You can also find me on YouTube. Here's my YouTube channel. And you can also, I have regular horoscopes that are written and video blogs you can check out. And I try to educate people about all sorts of interesting stuff as I'm doing that. And then you can check out my website, which is nightlightastrology.com. And on nightlightastrology.com, if you want to get a reading, maybe check out what your birth chart looks like in whole sign houses. If you've never seen it before, or just get to know your chart together. That would be really fun. You can check out the readings tab. You can also check out my certification courses or private apprenticeship if you're interested in studying with me. I have an upcoming course that's taking place starting in December. It's on Saturdays from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. It's a year-long program. It's all online. You can participate live in person or remotely by accessing the recordings in the group folder. There's optional guided structured homework quizzes, additional bonus material for every lesson of the 30 lessons in the course. There's also an additional 12 bonus guest lecturers that come in and speak in the program. Great people like Demetra George. I've had Stephen Forrest, Chris Brennan. Nadia's coming in the winter. So there's a great group of people that come and teach as guest teachers throughout the year. Those are part of your program. And there's you're learning ancient astrology for modern times. So if you like this presentation, imagine learning astrology from the ground up, from this old school perspective, all the way up into the space where you're getting to see me in about 10 classes after we get through the theory, read for people in live classroom settings. So you'll see me reading for live clients, and you can kind of see how the theory is applied. And I think it does nothing but improve your overall studies of astrology. So even if you're just like studying astrology personally, regardless if you want to do it for a profession or not, this is a great class. So, and if you want some referrals or, want to talk to any of the students that are in my current programs, I've run over 300 people through this class. So it's a great program, and I think it's going to be a great group of people. The early bird rate is in effect. You could check out tuition and stuff like that. I do have need-based tuition for those who are experiencing financial hardship as well, so you can check that out. Otherwise, check out the upcoming events page if you ever want to see who I'm having, like Nadia. And I think that's it. I really am so appreciative for the opportunity to have given a little talk in class on Nadia's channel. And I hope that you all prosper and grow and flourish in your studies of astrology, and that more than anything, that it bring you peace for the road ahead. Because at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I really believe that astrology is something that teaches us that our happiness is ultimately not rooted in what the planets are doing and whether they're in this place or that place in your chart or whatever. So hopefully the study of astrology keeps helping you to find centered, heart-centered peace and love in your life. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.